And, you know, just because we have an experience, meaning something's registered, doesn't mean that that experience has been metabolized or digested. And it requires the psychic enzymes, if you like, of embodied presence, of an open spaciousness and a certain sort of warmth, which is the expression of love, of compassion. It's those are the enzymes that are required to really access the nutrients that are contained within our experience, especially within our emotional experience and within our imaginal experience. Those also contain nutrients, nourishment that does require that we're able to have the enzymes, which are certain forms of awareness and love and compassion, to liberate that material, to allow it to be accessed and lived. And without those enzymes, you know, there's a way that all of this rich, symbolic wisdom of psyche and soma will just remain unintegrated. We won't be able to access and make use of it. And then from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense why so many of us are, you know, feel that depletion, not just in our physical bodies, which some of us might or might not feel, but it's almost like a depletion that's deeper in the soul, deeper in the subtle body, if you know what I mean. And then it's just important to remember, of course, that everything and anything that remains unintegrated within us, unfelt, uncompanioned, unlived, you know, it will inevitably find its way into our lives. You know, often in less than conscious ways that can generate a lot of unnecessary suffering and struggle. And this leaking of unconscious, unlived shadow material is an alchemical process, actually, and tends to unfold, we could say, in, you know, one of three ways, if we wanted to just name them. You know, what are they? What we call evocation, enactment, and somatization. Those are the three processes: evocation, enactment, somatization. Meaning that this unlived material, it will be evoked in others, meaning we'll see it there in them, we'll find it in them. Oh, there it is. Our rage, our need to be in control, our irritation, our narcissistic tendencies, our fears of intimacy, our emptiness, even our own beauty, our own wisdom, our own creativity, our own basic goodness. All of this has a way, if we're not in contact with it, where it will be located in the other. Again, another reason why relationship with that otherness is so essential. And so the psychological terms for this, of course, which I'm sure you've heard, are projection and transference. And so, or it will be enacted or played out within our relationships, especially those close personal relationships where we've taken that risk to allow another person to matter to us. It's that opens up the gates to enactment. You know, with our lovers or friends or family members or others, you know, through all sorts of unproductive conflict or misunderstanding or separation or just emotional activation of all kinds. The beloved has a very unique, uncanny ability to directly remind us, maybe you've experienced this, of everything and anything that remains unillumined or unlived within us. It's like the direct path. And maybe that's one of the primary roles of the other or the beloved in our lives. You know, their core essential role is to open up a portal in which that unlived material is able to be seen, to be held, to be digested, to be assimilated. that will enter into, what we call an enactment with them, a dramatic replaying out or reenactment of unlived material, by way of the dynamic aliveness, creativity of the relational field itself. So that's the evocation, the enactment part. And the third option is that the unmetabolized material will become what we call somatized. And you might imagine what that refers to is that it will present it will present itself in our bodies through all sorts of activating or confusing or uncertain or unwanted symptoms, just to use that word, in our bellies, in our hearts, in our throats, our skin, our legs, our lungs. It will appear in soma as feeling, as mood, as emotion, as bodily sensation of all kinds. And so this leaking by way of these three processes, this leaking isn't some sign of how unevolved we are, or how neurotic I am, or how unspiritual I am, or how something's gone wrong, or there's something wrong with me, or I've messed up again, or I'm a total mess, and on and on and on. It's an intelligent, natural, organic, compensatory process that occurs within the psyche, excuse me, where the psyche is doing whatever it must, whatever it can to create ways for us to reconnect with this material as it organizes and reorganizes our lives in the direction of wholeness. I mean, the reality is that we've all been given experience in this life that we haven't been able to process consciously. For whatever reason, it was just too much, too fast, overflow in the vessel. We just weren't able to metabolize it, and what happens then is it gets sequestered. It doesn't just go away. It doesn't just automatically transform or heal because it's pushed or relocated outside of awareness. If only that were the case. But it gets sequestered into underground storage, into neural networks, into the shadow held in our bodies, our bellies, our hearts, our throats, and our muscles and cell tissue, and the way we breathe, and our posture, and also in the figures who appear in our fantasies and our dreams. Those are personifications, one way to see them as personifications of this material, personifications of the unlived life that's longing now in some way to come back home, to come back into the light of compassionate present awareness, embodied awareness. Not to harm or take us down, or not to obscure our awakening, not as an obstacle on our path, as it can seem that way. Of course, not as an obstacle to the path, but as the very path itself. I mean, there are moments in my therapy practice, for example, where I'll be sitting with someone who is really struggling, but there's a way that they can't actually feel what's happening. They can't contact that felt quality of the open wound. And by this someone, of course, I mean all of us at times. And in response to the opening of the wound, as it begins to weep and seep and disclose its essence, for so many of us, there's a very natural protective sort of numbing that comes in, a bandaging, a way that we disembody or shut down or somehow turn away from that embodied vulnerability, from that achy, tender, sensitive, open wound, in the hopes of staying out of all of that survival level anxiety that has come to be associated with that, with certain feeling states. And speaking alchemically, or also from the perspective of say the tantric traditions, the invitation in those moments is into the very center of that wound. And of course, it's going to feel really shaky, really uncertain, really unknown, tender, claustrophobic, panicky to go there at times, maybe much of the time, at least in the beginning, until that association begins to dissolve a bit, until we start to experience that being in direct, conscious, compassionate relationship with my own embodied vulnerability is in fact safe. And in fact, being out of touch and being disembodied and being out of that is actually ultimately the most unsafe that I can be, the most split off and divided from myself that I can be, which isn't safe. But it's not like that in the beginning. I mean, it's unlikely that we're going to want to do that. We're going to sort of wake up in the morning and say, I'm so into it, man. Bring it on. I'm ready. Let me just go straight into that emptiness and just feel that all the way through. I mean, doesn't tend to work like that. But it's inside the wound where the medicine is already active. The medicine's there. It's inside the wound. It's not applied from the outside. From an alchemical perspective, from a tantric perspective, the wound contains its own healing tincture. And the very center of the wound is where the lost orphans of Psyche and Soma reside. It's where they live and where they move and where they breathe. Awaiting the possibility, of course, that one day they'll be able to unfreeze, to decrystallize, and to return home, to relink with that totality, with that wholeness, with that larger ecology that we are.